Yeah,
What do
yeah.
you
Well,
say?
when I went to the International Joint Conference of Artificial Intelligence, there was a
Hmm.
whole branch of of AI that's trying to kind of like understand story in a way that would
Hmm.
be able to tell stories even potentially. But
Hmm.
I feel like there's a part of our psychology that, is a movement of like narrative psychology, where meaning that the way that our brain processes information is through the lens of story, and that's kind of like the narrative psychology lens is just a lens into cognition of how we even understand the world is through story.
Hmm.
So, so when AI is trying to understand the world, then also trying to sort of like um, use that. So most of the stuff, I think, I just watched the Facebook's latest talk on what they called self-supervised learning, and there's this movement towards like just like trying to throw the ocean, literally the ocean of like trying to boil, they're trying to boil the ocean. So in
Hmm.
order to really get at a language model, you feed it the entire internet and the entire corpus of everything that's ever been said, basically. And then try to figure out if you're able to discern. The challenge is that and I did an interview with Edward Saatchi where he was like, what that results into things like GPT-3, which is the basically a language model that is,
That's what we're using. Yeah.
I think of it as a aggregate distillation of a cultural associative links around how things are
Yep.
connected or related to each other. So you feed it a question and then it sort of dives into those associative links based upon this corpus of the culture. And what Edward Saatchi was saying is that it's really difficult to take that sociological collective perspective and really have very distinct personal arcs of stories of characters
Hmm.
because you end up generalizing things up to the collective, but that doesn't mean that that's a oftentimes an individual perspective is going to be maybe unique or distinct. And so, how do you how do you embody things like character motivation or drive or things that are more like what a narrative designer would actually be focusing on?
Hmm.
That model of GTP3 has no concept of that.
No,
So, there's
no.
no ability to give personality, there's no ability to give any specific direction as to where things would go. So while it may be good as a prompt to say, what does the culture think about this? That's a lot different than say, this is what this character believes, which is a lot different than you need more sense making material to be able to understand philosophical worldviews and intentions and motivations and final causation and action for why people are doing stuff. That is probably more of a predicting factor for a story of a character than say GPT-3, which is a sociological reflection of
Mm.
cultural thought about what the general public believes. So it's the difference between sociology and psychology in some ways because it's taking a collective aggregate look. And then the GPT-3 is going into the collective, whereas what's missing from that collective is that individual character. There's a Robert McKee quote that Eric Darnell turned me on to at Sundance 2016. He said that the character is, you put characters into situations and under pressure, and then they make choices, and the choices they make are revealing of their essential character. And so it's that revealing of character that is missing from a GDP3 model because it's just an aggregate collective. It's not revealing, it's if anything, it's a collective character of society, of English speaking world.
That's right.
And maybe you can differentiate nuances of the character of a culture, but a character of a culture is different than a character of an individual. The challenge with AI in general is kind of that it's like a Markov chain associative link type of model. The GPT-3 is also it's looking at how word frequencies, like this word is frequently here next to this word. And so it will
Hmm.
be able to construct sentences that make sense because of the probabilistic nature of how the English language, but the AI has no idea what it's saying. It doesn't know what it means. And so what's missing there is the sense making framework of understanding what it means. And that's the sort of yes, you can get an AI to kind of spout out gibberish, but it's just like statistically saying these words are connected to each other. It has no idea what it's actually saying. It just is kind of
Mm.
taking a sample from that statistical landscape without knowing anything
Wow.
about what it means. And I think that's the that's the challenge, is like you have to get to the meaning. And if you, in order to get to the meaning, you have to, have a model of storytelling that would allow you to potentially, this is where it gets challenging, is to take something like as a story and then break it down to its component parts and then like have the AI go through and look at that. But that, a lot of times, like something like character is
Mm.
something that is not, these archetypes, from an astrological perspective, are multivalent, um, multidimensional, but they're sort of abstract potentials of what is possible. But it's kind of the from a mathematical perspective, and also philosophical perspective, it's this concept of potential. So there's
Mm.
potentials that are there. And so like a Saturn as a archetype is like around boundaries and discipline and all these aspects, and Mars is around like, your will and desire. So talking about will and desire and agency and boundaries. And so like when you have those two together, you can talk about how there's, an uncontrolled impulses of like transgressing boundaries and
Mm.
having fights around that. But to look at a story and then to be able to extrapolate the archetypal potentia realm, and to generalize it, to be able to tag it, is something that is, difficult even sometimes for humans to do, to be able to say, this is what this story is about. These are the themes of the story. And
Yeah.
so there's the different mini layers of like our embodied experiences for an entire lifetime of like what it means to like hold up a stop sign or something, like, oh, I know when I'm driving, that means stop, or there's a stoplight. But there's a larger concept within AI, which is common sense reasoning, which is essentially creating a model of the world that's based upon all of these kind of fundamental primitives around embodied experiences that allow us
Mm.
to understand the world. And so, in some ways, it gets the challenge of artificial general intelligence, which is being able to have AI that's being able to generalize all these things and understand the world like a human does. And
Mm.
so the challenge of like, in some ways being able to understand and tell a story is a Turing test for the 21st century for AGI.
Yeah.
So it's the and so what Michael Mateus is, his whole approach is that like, it's like, look, within story worlds, you're able to understand and set a very bounded context. And it's from within that context that you can kind of avoid a lot of the trappings of AGI, because it doesn't have to be generalized to the point. It just has to work within the context of this story world that you've
Uh-huh.
created. And
Uh-huh.
because of that, then you can start to maybe use AI techniques that wouldn't be applicable to a generalized context. But because you know a lot of information about the context, and you know a lot of information about the characters, then how can you start to, I guess, help bootstrap that, or have the problems that it's solving be, rather than having the GPT-3 trained upon the entire corpus of all of the English spoken language on the internet,
Mm.
it's more bounded into like science fiction genres. But even then, it still doesn't have the ability to understand the themes and the contexts. Context is probably the biggest,
Yeah.
um, and the
Agree.
character motivations and the drives and the feelings that, there's like primitives of a story that, have yet to be broken down, and have, like, you could create a corpus of data and try to break down and label all that data. But even at that, in the absence of having like more of a, there's like a hierarchy, like a top down hierarchy of a world model versus the bottom up, like just associative links. And that's the the challenge of, say, like an AI problem of having like zero shot learning with, as an example, just as this is just as an example, like as a human being, you could read a Wikipedia article and you could see this is what this bird looks like. And then
Mm.
you as a human could see that bird and say, oh, I read a description about that on Wikipedia. That's that bird. That's zero shot learning. That means the first instance you see that, you know what it is.
Uh-huh.
Right. Zero, that type of like knowledge representation through language, and then have the perceptual experience is something that AI hasn't necessarily fully figured out.
No.
How to have the world model to be able to have that type of Wikipedia encyclopedic knowledge, and how that interfaces with the bottom-up perceptual construction of things. You tend to have one or the other, but you need both. And so it's like there probably are techniques to be able to have that. And I'm sure that there's the cutting edge of narrative AI that is at the forefront of this, because the test is whether or not the AI is able to kind of tell a story. The ability to be able to read a story and understand it and understand all the characters and say, oh, you just watched this the Matrix movie. Tell me who Neo is. What's Neo want? Who is what is this existential dilemma? What is it as a character? What is he learning? Where is his arc going? What's his motivations? What is he feeling moment to moment? I mean, those are all things of like that's where you would need to get to, of like having someone who's an expert look at a movie and describe all those things I just described, and then have the AI do the same thing to watch the movie and be able to describe and talk about the movie like a film critic. But I don't know if I don't that in that may actually be a test for AI that it's artificial generally intelligent, that like that's something that humans can do at a very sophisticated level. But you know, like even a film critic, could a film critic give labeled data to a machine to be able to have them replicate that? Because how much of all of that stuff is just a part of being a human?
That's right.
That humans have a whole aspect of our embodied experiences and our understanding of what it means to be a human, and all those embodied metaphors. So it really gets to the heart of like this challenge, this problem is like, actually, if you solve it, you kind of solve AGI, because it's like you're able to do things that are kind of pushing the limits of what the technology can do. It's not means it doesn't mean it's impossible. I think we'll get there, but it's also like at the forefront of some of the most challenging problems in the field. There's a lot of
Oh,
theories. I mean, it's not that we don't have any idea at all. I mean, there's
no,
concepts
true.
like
Okay, true.
embodied cognition is a big uh, idea that has been gaining a lot more traction within neuroscience, meaning that, you know, that,
Yeah,
um,
tell me
you know,
about the embodied cognition. I've heard that term in relation to VR a lot.
so usually when you think about cognition, you think about your brain kind of as a computer. But that the idea of embodied cognition is sort of an extension of distributed cognition, meaning that like we don't just understand things in the abstract, we actually have embodied experiences that
Mm,
like for every experience, like our concept of moving up or down is from our embodied experiences of moving up and down. And so
mm,
an example that's often given is like when I say the word kick, it actually is kind of like firing the motor neurons in your brain. When you think of that as an abstract concept, you actually kind of like have an embodied experience of what it means to kick something because you've kicked
mm,
something before. And
mm,
so there's this, you know, kind of the predictive coding theory of neuroscience that has this kind of dialectic between the the schematic conceptual models of the world that we have in our mind versus
mm,
our embodied visceral experiences. And there's always a dialectic between our embodied experiences versus our schematic representation and abstractions of
mm,
those experiences. But that the but that you can't separate them, that you can't just say that all of cognition is this sort of abstraction, that actually the only reason why that abstraction could exist is because of the embodied experiences that we've had as
mm,
a human. And it's through that embodiment. And also the distributed cognition means that we're embedded into a context. And so we have our cognition is within a contextual domain, meaning that we are embedded in relationship to ecological psychology. This process philosophy is kind of like trying to think about these things in relationship as an ecological system, so that our cognition is not only a part of what is happening in our body, but our body's relationship to the world around us and environment. And
right.
so it's the environment in our body and our brains that are all, so to kind of think of cognition as just a mental abstraction is kind of missing out the embodied aspect. And so part of that embodied aspect is be able to interact with the world and to learn from our interactions from the world. And so
Mm,
thinking about in the concept of AI, what does an AI mean to be able to have embodied interactions within a virtual context or within a robotic context? So
Huh.
starting to see how robots are kind of like the embodied manifestation of how that could be an interactor for how robots are able to potentially interact with the world and learn about the world, and how they start to model the world around them. And so these agents that are within these virtual worlds then are, even within the AlphaGo or AlphaZero, you being able to do that in the context of the Go game, but also chess, where you have the kind of like you're playing chess against each other, and by playing the chess, then it's them kind of interacting with this kind of the rules of that game. Well, the
Right.
rules of the world are the ways in which that they're either within a virtual simulation. So, as an example, like computer vision, of being able to train computer vision algorithms by having a virtual cars driving around a virtualized world, with
Mm.
kind of replicating the world and trying to have all the stop signs and all the crosswalks and all the captures you fill out that are basically training all of the AI perception for how to detect bicycles and motorcycles and stop signs and crosswalks, all these things that, in order to have a car that's driving safely, has to be able to understand
Mhm.
how it relates to the world, preferably not by doing like a baby and interacting and hitting a pedestrian and saying, "Oh, now I've learned what a pedestrian is," but to do that within a virtualized context so that they can understand those how to perceive those things and to detect them and to understand them, for the algorithm that, in the case of a self-driving car, is to how to drive safely and how to follow the
Mm.
rules of the road and to not, get in an accident. But that as a metaphor is kind of like what we will probably eventually do with, in terms of AI as being in a story world and understanding other characters and what's happening with other interactions, and being able to kind of test and interact, um, who a character is based upon your direct interaction with that character. Um,
Mm.
so the Westworld kind of style of these personalities, that are there, but you don't have an experience of that until you're actually in the same world, being able to interact with them and engage with them. Yeah, I do think that's probably the one area that is the ready for prime time more than anything, is in
Mm.
collaboration with humans that are understanding the dimensions and aspects of story to kind of
Mm.
have on guardrails. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen the different experiences. Like, I think it was with Thomas Middleditch and something like Sunshine. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
a Ars Technica a number of years
Sunspring.
ago. Sunspring, yeah,
Yeah.
where they just have the corpus create something, and then the actors, it's up to the actors to imbue the meaning into it. And I was
Yeah.
amazed to see how much the actors can still imbue meaning into something that's essentially gibberish. But I do think that the collaborative aspect is really, a lot of potential there. However, um, I don't know if I don't know if you've listened to the This American Life, that a story about GBT3 and a woman who was dealing with the grief of her
Yeah.
sister. It was in a, I don't know if did you hear that story?
It did, from December last year. Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just listened to that actually about a week ago or so. My wife had heard it and played it for me. And so it was like eight or nine different iterations. And so,
Yes.
like, at first the AI was just kind of going on this whole track of like sports, whatever. Like, so that's what I mean. Like, there's like these associative links that happen. Like, somebody started talking about lacrosse or running or something, and then somehow that associative link came up, so that when she's trying to talk about her dead sister, it kind of goes off in this whole other tract of like something that's completely different context, and but it's just
Okay.
a associative link. So she's talking about grief and death and grieving,
Mm.
and so she's had to like keep kind of like giving that as a prompt, like, my sister is dead, and start from there, and then
Mm.
but also kind of guide it in a way that for her case, she was having trouble even writing about it, right? So then she would say something, the AI would say something, but the AI would be wrong. And so then she would be like, no, not this. And then that actually gave her something to push against,
Yes.
because she kind of had faced this writer's block to the point where the AI was kind of like a naive, like I think of it as a sociological uh,
Void.
collection that
Oh
is
no.
able to like be hard to really direct because it's just thinking about things in terms of aggregates and statistical probabilities of what's connected to based upon these higher dimension features that, these features that then have many ways in which that they're related to each other. And it ends up that it's able to kind of cohere down into something that logically makes sense, but is just completely a different contextual domain. And that understanding context is one of the things that AI does not do a good job of navigating. So if you're trying to like in this case, she was really trying to talk about her sister who had died. And then it starts to talk about like exercise. Well, that's a different contextual domain. So having like as humans, we understand what those contextual domains are because of language of, linguistically, it's called pragmatics, meaning that like, as an example, when I say the word script and I'm talking to a film writer, they're talking about like a screenplay. If I say script and I'm talking to someone who's a programmer, especially a front end developer, they're going to think JavaScript and they're going to think like, so a word like script has contextual information that is communicated by the larger context of who I'm talking to and what the context is. And that's
Of your life story,
linguistically
your life experience.
well, it's more like pragmatics is like the contextual domains of how different words have different meaning in different contexts. When you look up a definition, humans are unable to navigate those contextual domains. But thematically, from a story perspective, sometimes it's difficult for the AI to channel switch and understand the contextual domains because context is actually a big part of common sense reasoning. Because the common sense reasoning is something that is never, it's like the water we're swimming in. And humans are so good at navigating context that we never leave much trace because we can solve the complexity of the many possibilities of like when I hear someone say script, I'm like, is this person more a filmmaker or are they more a computer programmer? Are they talking about like films? Are they talking about computer programming? And like it could just be a very small thing that allows me to make that decision as to whether or not what context they're talking about. But in terms of the domains of human experience, it's different contextual domains and stories. There's many aspects of our lives that are kind of, and from an astrological perspective, they explicitly lay out in terms of the houses. So the first house is identity, and second house is values and money, and third house is communication and siblings and your neighborhood, and fourth house is your family. The fifth house is creativity and kind of sex and other hobbies, and sixth house is medical context. Seventh house is your romantic partnerships or business partnerships or enemies. Your eighth house is death or collective resources. Ninth house is religion or higher education or travel, spirituality. The 10th house is career or your public reputation or the government. 11th house is the friends and community and culture. And the 11th house is kind of like the being in prison or exile or the self-undoing, trauma, escapism, but also things that are occluded or hidden or kind of dreamlike qualities. So I think of it as like in terms of VR, like accessibility. So people who are kind of exiled from society but need to have access and accessibility concerns. So, but each of those contextual domains, we have ways in which that everybody's life and identity has aspects that are connected to each of those contextual domains. Also, our privacy has different things that are connected to those two contextual domains. Identity is connected to those contextual domains because who you are as a professional is different than who you are with your friends, than who you are with people who share hobbies, from who you are with your family, who you are with just yourself, who you are with a romantic partner. So all of those contextual domains are reflected in our identity, but also privacy, but also in terms of story. Part of storytelling is to kind of take us into these different contextual domains of someone's life. We learn about their backstory. We learn about how they operate at work. We learn about how they are around their friends. And within each of these contexts, as they put under different situations, then we learn a part of their quote unquote essential character. So what are the qualities of what makes this person who they are based upon their relationship to those contexts? Well, I think this is obviously something that is where we want to go. But again, I think there's challenges of, say, like as an example, Black Lives Matter or Me Too, where things that happen after those cultural epochs where
mm,
you look at the sense of stories before that, and they're clearly not taking a lot of those things into consideration in terms of racism or sexism. I mean, they're
for
kind of
sure.
embedded where you watch something that was produced back then, and if you're like, if this is produced today, it would never even get greenlit because
Mm,
it's just
mm,
so incredibly problematic on so many different layers. And
mm,
even in shows of, I mean, my wife and I have been watching Cobra Kai, and there's so many aspects of like the lack of Asian American Pacific Islander representation, and
I
that's
know.
all written by white guys, and so there's ways in which even shows that are out there today have these kind of cultural blind spots where they're not
Hmm, hmm,
like taking into those aspects of diversity into consideration. So the challenge with taking, say, the corpus of entire industry of the entire cinematic history of any culture, India or America, is
mm,
that, you know, you start with the KKK and all this other stuff that is like things that the culture evolves, and AI doesn't have a good idea of how to model that evolution of
right.
culture.
Mm,
Um, it's the kind of critical theory that comes from, you know, feminism and sexism and racism and ableism, all these sort of lenses that are able to read through, but like there needs to be AI at each of those different layers. So for me, I take a very pluralistic approach, meaning that like for every framework that you have, there's things that are going to be revealed, but things are also going to be hidden.
mhm,
So like you could train an AI to be more feminist aware so that you could like have the feminist's perspective on the power dynamics of how gender is being represented in these different stories, and then a race lens, and then colonial lens. And then,
mhm,
so, but each of these things have to be kind of stacked up on top of each other. And that's where
mm,
the human is the good way to kind of like check some of these things, because otherwise the risk is that like GTP3 is a great job of collecting what the cultural bias is, but the cultural bias is not where it needs to be as an aggregate. So it's going to kind of reflect a lot of these racist and sexist and things. Like there's things that people would say, talk about Muslims, and you put in different things about the religion of Islam, and then you get back all this sort of anti-Muslim sentiment because
yeah.
it's reflecting the aggregate perspectives of the culture. So
Mm,
there's something
mm,
that's inherently problematic to sort of like take a collective sociological lens and then to try to feed that directly back into the stories without having that deeper critique and deconstruction, because the AI is not smart enough to be able to do that. So if you just rely upon the AI to be able to
yeah.
do all those writing, then it's just going to be kind of reflecting the biases of that culture. So there's a lot of caveats that I think about when I hear like the desire to be able to take in the corpus. There's ways that it needs to understand the fundamentals of the character, but there's
Mm,
these other relational dynamics of how the culture has actually shifted over time. And there's
that's
no
true.
good way for the AI to understand that cultural evolution. It's
Mm,
just going to take everything as equal um, in terms of, and it's not going to be able to perceive those invisible dynamics that are implicit within the language, even just saying words that
mm,
we no longer say
mm,
because they are not fully inclusive. Even saying crazy or insane is ableist language that preferences people who are able-bodied or that are have the lack of mental health taboos. So, so there's still even the way that we use language today that is reflective
mm.
of all of those things. So it's so I'm more of a skeptic that the
Yeah.
AI is going to be able to, especially on its own. It needs to have that person there because it has to have those checks and balances. Otherwise, it's going to just be perpetuating the harm. Um, there's gaps.
True.
And so then there's the AI ethics, which is, well, how do you train things so that it's more comprehensive? And I think part of what I've come to at least is that there's always going to be some bias. You're never going to ever eliminate bias. And so then the challenge is mitigating that balance, that
Mm,
bias, because there's always it's like Gödel's incompleteness. Gödel showed that you can never have a formal system that is basically both consistent and complete, right? So you're never going to have anything that has every single perspective represented, because otherwise there are going to be contradictions and inconsistencies.
mm,
You could have that if you have individual characters that are in debate with each other, debating these different perspectives, then you can start to have more of those mini individual perspectives kind of represented. But usually that doesn't
I,
happen. It's just
I think it can't be
collectively.
consistent and complete at this simultaneously.
Yes. Yes. You can't have both. So
Okay.
completeness would be that you have every single representative perspective, but the challenge is that those perspectives are often contradictory with each other. So if you have to have like an ability to handle those paradoxes of how to deal, I mean, that we have no lack of polarization within the United States or anywhere around the world, but just to, take around safety and security in terms of like, how do you represent the most safe things, but also the most secure things, meaning that like, maybe there's aspects of the safety where we have all of our actions that are tracked, but then we lose our safety or privacy. So that's sometimes there's these mutually exclusive dialectics where you can't have like perfect safety and perfect security.
Right.
Like there's these trade-offs. So there's mutually exclusive aspects of that where sometimes there are these mutually exclusive things where you can be really one or the other. And other times it's like, if I watch a VR experience, I'm not going to be able to give it the best feminist critique because I don't have the embodied experiences. I can only talk about the feminist critiques from an abstracted perspective, not from an embodied perspective. And same thing for, kind of being cisgendered or, a white male. There's not like a viable kind of, the critique that I provide could be more intellectualized, but not embodied. So, my wife saw the piece Gnomes and Goblins, and there's no women represented, no female represented bodies in Gnomes and Goblins. They're all male representing. But they're like, well, they're kind of like androgynous. Well, they're not androgynous, they're more male presenting. They have more male characteristics. And so you're basically creating a whole vision of a society that has no female representation in it. And my wife has, dealt with that a lot. And Jon Favreau is also within the context of doing the Boba Fett series. Same thing with the Sand People. There was no representation of female presenting characters within Sand People. It was all basically male presenting. And so same type of thing that he was doing within Gnomes and Goblins was also being replicated within Boba Fett, right? So there's certain sort of, certainly no lack of critique when it comes to the indigenous perspective and kind of the colonizing ways of the critiques around what was happening in both of those different pieces. But that's my point, is that you could, for any story, you could take a feminist critique, an indigenous critique, colonialist critique, or race critique, and that it's difficult to have one person represent all of those perspectives. So there's kind of a fundamental incompleteness there, but also like, to counter out the incompleteness, you have to sort of adopt this radical pluralism to try to get as many different perspectives as you can to ensure that you're getting all the bases covered, because it's difficult to have one lens that covers everything, because there's always going to be things that are left out. And so that's the challenge with AI as well, is because you have to think about it, that it has to be able to look at all these things simultaneously and then sort of spit out one thing. But then when it does that, then how does it kind of resolve all those different competing things of making sure that's representing all those perspectives?
Sure.
So the experience was that they created a simulation world, and the conceit of the world was that it's a whole town, a whole village that's been simulated. There's all these people that have relationships to each other. You're dropped into that world and someone has died. And your job is to go around the town and figure out who has died and to notify the next of 10 who has died. And the way that it the way that it was done was that there was someone in the background running the simulation.
Bad News? It's called Bad News?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Bad News. So Ben Samuel was an improv actor who was embodying each of the different characters. And so let's say you find out someone's dead, you see some describing information, and then you go to a bar to like try to figure out who this person is. And you're trying to just be vague because you cannot reveal that this person is dead to someone who's not the next of kin. You're trying to just get information around who this person is, their identity, and who their parents might be and where they might be. And so then it's a real-time simulation. And so these people are moving around. So you could go into a bar and start to talk to people, and you have to kind of like come up and create these fake stories of like who you are and why you're doing and why you're getting information about this. So you have to come up with a cover, like a cover story as to why you're asking all this information into this. You're kind of coming in as an outsider into this town, and they don't know who you are, and you're trying to like get this information from them. So it's a dance between understanding who you are in that moment, telling this cover story, but also trying to unpack the relational dynamics of who this person is connected to and get more information so that you can go to the family's home and inform them that their son or daughter has died. And so this is a case where it's a real-time simulation that's the world that you're in, but that because things are moving or dynamic, then you're trying to like, I mean, this is a type of experience where you could literally roam around for days and not know it, but they're trying to create it so that it's like within the context of 2 or 3 hours so that you're able to kind of go through this. And so there's someone in the back end who's helping to provide some clues and hints to the improv actor who might drop some hints that then you could use to be able to then take as a lead to go into somewhere else.
Piece together the
Help
character.
guide you into this whole world. But the point isn't just to exhaustively meet everybody in the world and to explore the world. The goal is to find this person within the world and inform them that their child has died, their virtual child has died. And so the way in which that you're able to express your agency, but also have a lot of narrative agency when it comes to, in terms of making you feel like you're immersed into this world, but also that you're in the context of this virtual world and it's completely abstracted and you have an iPad interface that you're able to go through and kind of talk to different people. But I thought that that was a brilliant way of letting the humans do things that humans are good at, which is kind of creating these characters, creating these stories. You know, there's different ways that the personality is described to Ben Samuel, who's embodying these improv characters. You're like, there's 6 people in a bar. And so you could presumably talk to all 6 people and then he would sort of embody each of them with this distinct temperaments and characters and personalities and feelings and whatnot. And then you're exploring these through these conversations, but then going from location to location. And the other one was that this challenge of like architecting the dynamics of the story. So the Hamlet piece that was more simulation based.
Yeah,
and
that
so
one
that
I didn't listen to. Yeah.
The gist of that is that like you know, say like something like Sleep No More, that when you see Sleep No More, anything that you do doesn't change how the actors are acting. The actors are going to be basically running their loops no matter, and like completely independent to what you do, right? So there's little narrative agency. So the experiment of this simulation was to say, let's say if you change this thing within the Hamlet, how would that change the rest of the entire play, right? So it's like your little degree of agency would actually change the course of how things play out. So it's this idea that like there's a lot more gradations of the agency that could have different versions of like, this has to happen then, this has to happen then, this has to happen then, in order to kind of shift the dynamics of how the overall kind of Shakespearean story of Hamlet is playing out. But there's a lot of deep simulation that's trying to sort of play out. Well, given that this character, you know, may have been killed here, but if this person stays alive, and then there's this whole other realms of potential that character could do, and then like trying to collapse those realms of potential down into what actually happens in the actual simulation. So you can imagine how difficult that would be for immersive theater actors to be fed like, this is the state of the world, given that all of these other micro sort of aspects of agency taken forth. So it's very difficult kind of translate the state of the story world given the agency of the user. Because that's a difficult problem, most immersive theater pieces don't even bother. They're just like, you're just a ghost. You can't impact this at all. So there's other aspects of the AI to be able to do that deep simulation that starts to get into that like kind of the mini worlds interpretation of like the many possible worlds, but yet maintain those possible worlds to a degree that is able to kind of continue that state based upon taking many different actions over the course. And that it's a looping game. So because it's looping. I don't know. I haven't played it, so I don't know if it's looping over the course of one day or over the course of multiple days. I think it's over the course of one day. Otherwise, it would just get really, you know, difficult to understand how it plays out. But you imagine that, like, kind of the Groundhog's Day, you are playing this over again, but able to make little shifts and changes. And based upon
Mm,
those changes, how does that shift the overall events that unfold over that day, with the goal
right.
of you trying to save Hamlet or whatever, kind of change the fates. You know, there's the certain fatedness within a play like Hamlet, and you're trying to like shift those fates. And so you have many opportunities to try to shift those fates. Um, so something like that, AI is really good at sort of modeling the world in a way that goes above and beyond what a human could be able to reasonably understand or comprehend, or
Yeah,
even direct
absolutely.
actors how to do that.
You